remain high. And of course, there's the not missing the forest for the tree, Lindsay, the argument that I'm picking up. And Ali, I wanted to get to you as well, because, Dr. Ashley Tellis, doyen of South Asia foreign policy in Washington, came out with a great column yesterday in Foreign Affairs. And he kind of spoke about India, but there was a lot of China factor involved, given India and China are neighbors. And of course, China is everywhere on the world stage, from security concerns to semiconductors. And he said, Beijing has built a large, more sophisticated military. It's deeply integrated itself in the Indo-Pacific in ways that enhance its economic heft and provided with enormous, sometimes choking political influence. To quote from the op-ed, Lindsay, I'm sure, worked a lot on this when she was in the NSC and in the Pentagon. Given that you follow China closely, I suppose two parts of this question. How does this test ASEAN centrality? And seeing that not all of ASEAN nations see Beijing as a threat, which is, of course, some are more dependent on Chinese investments, perhaps the one with lower GDPs. And two is, what is Beijing's grand strategy beyond extending its spheres of influence in what it sees as the sacrosanctity of the nine dashed line territory?
Oh, well, first, Akshobh, thank you so much for the invitation, and really just hats off on this webinar series that you've put together. It's really an honor to be here, and especially alongside two scholars and practitioners for whom I have such great admiration, Lindsey and Evan. So thanks for having me. So I think as far as ASEAN centrality goes, one way of looking at intensifying strategic competition between the United States and China is that members of ASEAN feel more squeezed. And I think certainly you can see the pressure angle. The alternative framing is opportunity to exercise more agency. I think for many member countries of ASEAN, they say that we are increasingly a battleground of strategic competition between Washington and Beijing. Washington is increasingly trying to court us. Beijing is increasingly trying to court us. And to the extent that you have more suitors, more strategic suitors, perhaps you have more optionality. Perhaps you can exercise more agency. So there is a pressure. There's a pressure perspective if you're ASEAN. There's also an opportunity perspective if you are ASEAN. As far as what China's strategic ambitions are, beyond the ones that you mentioned, Akshobh, I think I would identify a few. One, I would begin at home. That is, China's domestic imperatives. I think that China, particularly in light of growing economic pressure, whether it's in the form of tariffs, in the form of sanctions, export controls, I think that China, at home, especially amid mounting growth headwinds, slowing growth, demographic decline is beginning to pinch more. I think that imperative one, if you're China, is doubling down, really accelerating and intensifying efforts to achieve greater financial self-sufficiency, greater technological self-sufficiency, kind of building an economic force field to insulate it from greater economic pressure from advanced industrial democracies. I think further afield, China, of course, is looking to extend its economic influence. We saw, I think, actually just last month that China and ASEAN, since you mentioned ASEAN, China and ASEAN, they concluded negotiations to upgrade the scope or to expand the scope of their free trade agreement. And I think that upgrade will likely be finalized later this year. So extending your influence economically, and then I think diplomatically. I think in light of some of the concerns that that Lindsey raised about the Trump administration's foreign policy, it's sort of doubling down on America first. To the extent that U.S. allies and partners, core U.S. allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific are newly concerned about the return of America first, newly concerned about the durability, the viability of America's commitment to the region, and to the extent that they are concerned about some of the disruptions that the administration has introduced, I think particularly on the economic front, I think that cocktail of factors allows China, rightly or wrongly, but allows China to present itself as a potentially stabilizing force. And to say, look, there's a lot of unpredictability coming out of Washington. There's less unpredictability coming out of Beijing. And I'm not saying whether that assessment is right or wrong, sincere or disingenuous. It's just, I think, an objective, consideration. So just to summarize, I think if you're China, one, beginning at home, doubling down on efforts to enhance self-sufficiency. Two, looking to expand economic influence, whether with ASEAN, with other countries in the Indo-Pacific. And three, looking to present itself rightly or wrongly as a contrast to the United States, which I think many allies and partners see now is increasingly a source of instability in the region and beyond, and China is looking to present itself as a contrast.
Absolutely. Given the fact that in ASEAN, that China does see its sacrosanctity of the region, and a lot of the smaller countries are dependent increasingly on Beijing's investments, and we've seen that also in the BRI context. And Evan, I wanted to take that China question and kind of turn it to another part of the region. You touched on this a little bit in your in Shangri-La in some of your assessment. Key flashpoint, of course, from the South China Sea, also a little northern is the Taiwan Strait. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, all these analogies have been drawn in terms of Taiwan's size and vulnerability with the larger aggressor of Ukraine, Russia, and China and Taiwan. Apart from security concerns, that looking at another big factor, supply chains that have been upended and eroded since the pandemic 5 years ago, given Taiwan's hub is semiconductor manufacturing and a lot of what Lindsey worked on with, IndusX and everything else is involving this critical emerging technology. This is sort of a concern for Washington, especially the previous administration had outlined their priorities with Chip and Sciences Act, where the Commerce Department, under then Secretary Gina Raimondo, took on a lot of the onus for this. So how do you see the Taiwan element here right now? And what were some of the conversations in Shangri-La that touched on the vulnerability of that region?
Well, I think certainly Taiwan has always been a key discussion point for the last few years at Shangri-La and beyond. I think certainly in Southeast Asia, the conversation in the last 2, 3 years have gotten a bit more intense. I think Southeast Asian states in particular are becoming a lot more willing to discuss future contingencies of a potential Taiwan scenario, but also the kind of issues that they have to deal with. And number one, obviously, is there's more than 800,000 Southeast Asian citizens in Taiwan. And so trying to figure out potentially running the largest NEO operation in history for Southeast Asia is going to be a tall order, which is why I think the focus of Southeast Asian states, whether through ASEAN or through their own bilateral engagement, has always been to try to find a way to not talk about Taiwan, and try to tone down some of the issues. But of course, one of the key highlights of Shangri-La every year is to actually for Southeast Asian states to look and see whether or not US and China could actually communicate and manage some of these issues like Taiwan, precisely because of those dire political, economic, and certainly security consequences of a Taiwan scenario. So what I think is different, I think, in the last few years is in addition to Taiwan being a top issue between US and China, but the region also saw a huge focus from Europe to talk about Ukraine. The last few years, we've also seen the region becoming much more aware of the issues around Myanmar and the South China Sea, as well as in Shangri-La a couple of weeks ago, between Thailand and Cambodia, which nobody really saw coming across the region. So what I think has been growing is that it's not just, yes, Taiwan is important, we all know that, but I think the rest of the region is seeing, actually, it's not just Taiwan. Some of it will relate back to Taiwan, especially when it comes to US and China, but the proliferation of security challenges, whether from the region or from outside of the region, like Europe, like the Middle East, have been perhaps increasingly overcrowding the issue of Taiwan a little bit.
Yeah, I think the fact that right now we're given there's so much work even being done in the semiconductor space, that vulnerability of supply chains is sort of what's kept the previous administration focused. And I'm just curious to see how Secretary Hegseth is now looking at that issue. And Lindsey, on the note of Secretary Hegseth, just coming back to his speech, it was very, as Evan would say, it was very crisp and forward. But he had some sound bites there. One of those was, "We are here to stay," boldly and clearly. But he also kind of spoke about Asian partners sort of emulating a handful of EU nations, boosting their defense spending to 5% of GDP. And President Trump has spoken about this before in terms of his umbrage with European allies not spending more on NATO and not having the US taxpayer having to foot the bill all the time. But in your experience of dealing, with ASEAN and Indo-Pacific countries, when you were DASD, especially the smaller ones, where military spending is spiking and a lot of developing countries, are still focusing on the developing goals. Given that ASEAN is not a monolith, there's Singapore on one hand, but there's Laos and Vietnam and others. There are more emerging economies. How do you think this has gone down with some of these countries that depend on Washington's economic and security guarantee towards this goal of free and open Indo-Pacific? Because the concept of a Pax Americana in the Indo-Pacific until, perhaps more recently.
Thank you. Yeah, I was pleased to see Secretary Hegseth at least acknowledge the deep irony of saying that, you should see Asian countries emulate European defense spending, which was a phrase that probably no one ever thought that they would hear. Look, a few thoughts. One, it is not surprising in the slightest that the Trump administration is focused on this issue, because it is very much a continuation of what I think you heard from them, and certainly from President Trump in his first term as well. A really strong focus on the idea of burden sharing, and wanting allies and partners to, as he would say, quote, pay their fair share. Now, I think there's been more focus on that on the NATO front, but as European partners have sort of made those commitments, I think, that conversation is going to shift more to the Indo-Pacific. And we've seen signs of this already. Bridge Colby, who's now the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, in his confirmation hearings, threw out what I think was a fairly surprising number for a lot of folks, saying Taiwan should be spending 10% of GDP on defense, which is a stunning number. I think we're going to see more of this. And I think that, to be fair, it is not wrong for the United States to say that there are partners in both Europe and in Asia who have, compared to the relative threat they are facing, probably been underspending on defense. That is true in many places. I think in the Indo-Pacific, we have seen over the last few years that the trend lines are moving in the right direction. Japan had typically been stuck at 1% of GDP on defense forever. And it has finally broken that cap, and defense spending is moving up. Now, I think one could argue it probably needs to move up a little higher than where it is, but it is moving up. Australia increasing its defense spending, Taiwan the same, South Korea. So I think the trends are all in the right direction. The question that I'm going to be watching, I think, is, do you see the Trump administration targeting numbers that are so high that it creates a wedge in the alliance relationships? So Taiwan, though not a formal ally, I don't think anyone would say to you that 10% is actually a viable number in terms of defense spending. I think if Taiwan hit 5%, everyone would be thrilled and saying that's a historic amount of defense spending. I think if you saw folks like Australia and Japan and Korea hit 3.5%, that would still be huge increases. And so I think there is going to be a little bit of a tension and a dance here, where the Trump administration, I think, is quite intentionally aiming higher than they really think is realistic, because then you hope that maybe what your allies and partners spend is not quite that high, but better. But at the same time, I think they do not want to run the risk of, threatening partners in a way that creates real uncertainty beyond what's already there about the reliability of US security commitments. Because then I think you'll see a couple of things. Partners may decide this is not worth it, or they will increasingly do what I'm already seeing in some cases, which is look for defense partnerships elsewhere that are more reliable, which will have an impact on what the United States can do together with those partners, what kinds of capabilities they can deploy. Certainly for US defense industry will be a real concern if partners start looking elsewhere or just looking to their own sort of sovereign domestic capabilities.
Yeah, that's a great point, Lindsey, given that a lot of the conversation that we are seeing here in Washington is also polarized and has been for the past few years about the defense spending, about the budget. President Trump also came into office talking about slashing deficits, cutting and forgetting this concept of forever wars. And, of course, geopolitics works in its own way. On that note about defense spending and allies, seeking other partners. I mean, Ali, if you just think about it for a second, right? We talk about the elephant in the room being the dragon. China wasn't present in the room, and Secretary Higgs has even quipped about it, saying we're here and someone else is not. And unlike many years before, Beijing didn't send a top defense envoy, to offer a riposte to Washington's leading defense commentary, because that's sort of where Beijing sort of sees it's a sort of a fair game to send someone. I'm just curious why you think that is, given what you're seeing in China, but also just want to think a little beyond. China is also, as to look at the Mearsheimer concept of great power. So great powers also think beyond the neighborhood. So China's clearly pushing itself beyond the Indo-Pacific. We've seen that with investments in Latin America or Australia or in Djibouti, but it has interest in the Middle East. This comprehensive strategic partnership it has with Iran. It's a major energy importer, so it depends on Middle East thing. And plus, the BRI is a very big, important priority for China in Central Asia and the Caucasus as we talk about critical minerals. So again, giving you the hardest job of painting Beijing's grand strategy and helping everyone in Washington understand that.
Uh, I'll give some very impoverished answers to a very important set of questions and a very challenging set of questions. On the first question, why China didn't send its top defense official, I've heard a number of explanations, and I'll mention some of them. One was that there was a sense that any meeting between China's defense minister and Secretary Hegseth, given the views that Secretary Hegseth had articulated prior to coming to Shangri-La, there was a feeling that perhaps the meeting would be quite confrontational, wouldn't be particularly productive. Another explanation related is that China feels that if the overall relationship between the United States and China is sort of on the downward trend, if the overall geopolitical environment is unstable, that China tends not to send a top official. It prefers to do so when it feels that the U.S.-China relationship is a bit more stable, when the geopolitical environment is a bit more stable. Nonetheless, I think a missed opportunity for China. I think it's generally better to be present than not present. If you're not present, you're not there in the room to articulate your conception of regional order, to articulate your concerns and to articulate your viewpoints. Although China certainly was not wholly without representation, and in fact there were a number of Chinese defense officials who participated quite actively in Shangri-La. But nonetheless, I think a missed opportunity that China didn't send its top defense official. And then looking beyond the Indo-Pacific, and you mentioned, I'll just make sort of a brief note about the Middle East and then try to take a wider aperture. I don't think that China wants to be a sort of a U.S. style, superpower in the Middle East. And I think I would argue that, I think that China hopes that, and China has long hoped, I think for the past, quarter century now, that the United States will remain preoccupied in the Middle East. I remember, I think it was in maybe 2010 or 2011, there's a column that Steve Clemons wrote that always sort of stuck, that always sticks in my mind. And Steve Clemons, he interviewed, I think it was an official from China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I could be wrong, but a high-ranking Chinese foreign affairs official. And Steve put to his interlocutor, what is China's grand strategy vis-a-vis the United States? And this official quipped, and I think perhaps somewhat facetiously, but I think that there was also a grain of truth. He said, well, at least part of our grand strategy is that we hope that the United States continues to get bogged down in conflicts in the Middle East. Now, that was in the context of Afghanistan and Iraq. I would have to imagine right now that to the extent that this conflict between Israel and Iran intensifies, to the extent that it has potential to drag in the United States militarily, diplomatically, and otherwise, China might be relishing at that prospect. So that's just sort of a point on the Middle East. As far as sort of the broader aperture, I would say that there are probably three levels, reinforcing levels or dimensions of sort of Chinese diplomatic activity. The first would be, I think, strengthening relationships with sort of core competitors to the United States, core adversaries of the United States, whether it's Russia, whether it's Iran, whether it's North Korea. I think level two, I think China wants to make greater inroads with whether you call them middle powers, whether you call them pivot states. I know that there's sort of a wide variety of vocabulary, but these are basically powers. They're not necessarily great powers, but these are powers that in their respective regions command significant military, economic, and diplomatic heft. And importantly, they're looking very actively to avoid having to make a strategic choice between the United States and China. So these are maybe the Indonesias of the world, the South Africas of the world, the Turkeys of the world. So I think that China wants to deepen its inroads with those countries. The third level of effort, and I think arguably the fulcrum of China's grand strategy, is expanding its presence across vast swaths of the developing world, whether through the Belt and Road Initiative that you mentioned, whether through a trifecta of initiatives that China has unveiled in recent years. Its Global Security Initiative, its Global Development Initiative, its Global Civilization Initiative. And I think I'll be interested to see, I think it was just announced, I believe last month, this new mediation forum, this new international mediation forum that China has announced, again, demonstrating that it wants to expand its presence. So those would be, for me, I look at those kind of three levels of reinforcing diplomatic effort. And to the extent that the United States is preoccupied once more in the Middle East, to the extent that it is sending conflicting signals about its commitment to the Indo-Pacific, and to the extent that, and I think getting to a point that Lindsey was making earlier, to the extent that some of its policies are not only targeting China, but also in the same breath targeting core US allies and partners, that sense of dissonance, that sense of confusion, I think could also create strategic openings for Beijing.
Yeah, especially in the Middle East, Ali, you touched on. Don't forget, a few years ago, it was Iran and Saudi Arabia that they thought that sort of China would broker it, given that the United States obviously couldn't be in the room. And I think for a lot of those smaller states, be it West Africa or Middle East or something, or in Latin America particularly, they would depend on Chinese investment, given that China would almost say that, look, we're ready to invest in road, rails, ports, and highways. We don't care about your political system or your structure. That for many years, that people felt that Washington sort of spoke to many of these states, which is sort of why I think Secretary Hexet's speech was clarifying we're not here to comment on climate change or any of your the way you conduct your affairs. And I wanted to kind of talk about another part of the world, Evan. French President Emmanuel Macron sort of headlined the conference this year, and he spoke about this new third way, this of shared strategic autonomy between Asia and Europe, and almost a forthcoming Indo-Pacific strategy from Paris. Perhaps touch on the viability of that, and was President Macron also sort of saying, hey, there's a third alternative here. We don't need to be in this Manichaean duopoly between the US and China. We've seen this script before for 70 odd years between, two great powers in the past. And based on your reading and assessment that you've done of Secretary Hexet's address, would you see that Washington prefers that Europe stay in Europe, or is it more the merrier to protect the Indo-Pacific, that a stronger ASEAN-like NATO-ish, even though the Quad is not a security umbrella, but perhaps is this two competing school of thoughts? Washington wants more people in the Indo-Pacific, or Washington prefers Indo-Pacific be handled by Indo-Pacific powers?
Well, I think this is where things are quite interesting, because I do think the speech sort of represent perhaps somewhat of a contrast. Macron speak a lot about strategic autonomy. I think he mentioned that about 12, 15 times. And strategic autonomy is certainly something that many in the region can relate to, and in fact would say that it's their primary goal these days. But the challenge, I think, is number one, whether or not the kind of premise around a third way is actually sustainable. Because number one, you have to assume if you take on a third way premise, that means you do accept that you are viewing the region in a US-China lens, and which is not something that's always the most productive way. The second, I think, premise is obviously that if you are offering an alternative, that you are fundamentally different from either the US or China. Now, I think it's up to debate whether or not France is seen as fundamentally that different from the US and China. They say they are, but I think I would say half of Southeast Asia would kind of see France and Europe pretty much a bit more aligned with the US than China. And then the third is, of course, whether or not, if you are seeking an alternative, if you are in Southeast Asia, for example, is France really the credible third alternative compared to long-established partners to the region like Japan, like Australia, and dare I say even South Korea? Because what's challenging about US-China isn't just about the size, but the nature of engagement of US and China is also across multiple domains, from defense, from security, technology, trade, and investment. And I'm not entirely convinced with the argument that Europe altogether, or just specific European countries like France, UK, or Germany, can be a genuine third pole to the US and China for the rest of Southeast Asia, because these cross-domain presence and footprint is not something that you built over the last 10 years. Japan and Australia have worked on it for the last 30, 40 years. And so if you look at it from that perspective, I do wonder if the last premise, which is whether or not the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific is a single theater, is a viable proposition. Because if it is a single theater, then the question for Southeast Asia is it a two-way street? We have to say something about Ukraine, maybe about the Middle East. Is France going to lead the way on solving Myanmar and the South China Sea? Is France going to lead the way on the resolving of the Thai-Cambodia issue right now? And so if it is seen that there are many opportunities for collaboration between Europe and Asia, that's absolutely great. And there are certainly plenty of that, whether it's in the trade, cyber realm, or security. But let's not also jump into the position that any non-US China support or cooperation automatically leads or could be seen as a credible third alternative to US and China. as of this point, it's just a very difficult proposition, I think, particularly for many in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, that's an interesting question there, analysis there, Evan, about if will France sort of take on the mantle of playing, peacemaker for Myanmar or something, which is something that we only seen that the rather larger powers that US and China have been able to do. And I suppose from France's perspective or from some of the European perspective, it's where are transatlantic relations? Where is the fact that President Trump wants to cut spending on NATO? So what does that mean? Is it because do we get involved in a more important theater? But that's a good question to kind of take forward and think about that a little more. And Lindsey, just coming back to that seminal article yesterday that Dr. Tellis wrote in Foreign Affairs, and he wrote this, about New Delhi, and given you follow India so closely, if New Delhi wants to kind of constrain Beijing, it will therefore need Washington. None of the other Indo-Pacific powers, not even Australia or Japan, will be strong enough by 2050 to compensate for the United States, alluding to, 2047, India's 10-year centenary year of independence, when Prime Minister Modi has spoken about India being a developed nation and, well past all the $10 trillion mark. Given that New Delhi will play host to the Quad Leader Summit later this year, I believe we're hearing November. What's on the card from the security aspect and possibly a 2+2 ministerial coming up closer, where the foreign and defense heads, both the Minister of Defense and Minister of Foreign Affairs with the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State do get together. We know Secretary Rubio, one of his first act as Secretary of State was to convene the Quad foreign leaders in Washington. And I think we can expect New Delhi and Washington to build on the initiatives that they announced in February. US-India Compact, US-India Trust, very important initiatives and very complicated acronyms.
Yes, a lot of acronyms in that February joint statement for us all to enjoy trying to memorize. I think that the first priority for either a US-India 2+2 ministerial or the engagements that the US and India have during the Quad Summit really needs to be that there's a bit of a reset button that has to be pushed at this moment in time on the US-India relationship. Because I think what we've seen over the last several months is that the two sides got off to a huge start right out of the gate. You saw Quad foreign ministerial that happened literally on Inauguration Day, which is pretty unprecedented. You saw Prime Minister Modi come very early, a very ambitious joint statement. And then, candidly, I think we kind of tripped over ourselves, the US and India, in the partnership in the way that we came out of the recent US-Pakistan crisis. And that is quite unfortunate, because I think there was actually an opportunity to come out of that crisis stronger as partners, the same way that we did after the Galwan crisis, which I would argue actually incentivized a tremendous amount of US-India cooperation on security and defense issues. That's not where we are today. We saw, Pakistani Chief of Army Staff having lunch with the president just yesterday. We saw a call between President Trump and Prime Minister Modi that, if you look at the Indian readout of it, is an awful lot of India essentially saying how the United States is wrong about its messaging, about how the recent crisis ended. We've got to move past that, because the US and India need to be focused on China. And right now we're very stuck on being a little bit frustrated with each other. So what I hope people will return to is, one, a lot of conversation about US-India cooperation on defense industry. I think that's an area where both sides have had ambitions for a long time. It's been hard to get results. And quite frankly, there are at least 2 or 3 things, whether it's jet engines, combat vehicles, munitions, that are ripe for the taking, that I think we need to be able to conclude to demonstrate that US-India defense cooperation on industrial issues is viable, or else our industries aren't going to be as motivated to do it anymore. The second, the Quad is talking about some things on security that are very practical, things like logistics cooperation, providing satellite data to maritime countries around the region. All of that has to move forward, and it has been slow going. There need to be results, or I worry that people are going to say, hey, the Quad is, as we like to say in Texas, where I'm from, all hat, no kettle. That is a problematic narrative to be coming out of the Quad right now. And then the last thing that I would point to, and it doesn't sound like narrow security, but it is quite related. There are a couple of issues: energy cooperation and immigration that I think the Trump administration has identified as priorities. In particular, they want to see India move forward on nuclear liability legislation so we can cooperate on civil nuclear issues. And India is quite concerned about some of the immigration restrictions right now hitting Indian students. That impacts security, because if it doesn't look like a civil nuclear deal that we concluded over 10 years ago can actually be implemented successfully, I think it impacts how the United States thinks about similar big, ambitious deals with India. And on immigration, if India is worried that even its students are not secure in coming to the United States, and that impacts that flow of immigration and talent, that is a real loss for the United States in the long term. When you think about something like 70% of the designers that we have working in our semiconductor firms right now are Indian or Indian American. So those are two issues that I think have real security impacts, even if they're not narrowly seen as defense in the traditional sense.
100%, Lindsey. I mean, I think what you touched on, even though the hats you wore in the Pentagon and NSC were very defense hard power, this also touched on what America's potent force was: soft power, the allure of the American dream, the fact that these great research institutions that did work on cutting edge technology, because if we're talking about a China plus one strategy for India, or talking about an alternative to China, then these institutes do feed into a lot of the ecosystem that we have. I mean, there's not a coincidence that Stanford is in Silicon Valley and Silicon Valley companies around Stanford. It feeds into it. And Ali, I'll get to a question later to you on, Joe Nye, bless his soul, wherever it is, and soft power. And just before I do that, I just want to remind people to please put in any questions you have for the chat box. As we have 15 minutes left, we'll try to get to any as we can. But Ali, before I get to soft power, I wanted to speak on hard power. Secretary Hegseth reiterated that the Trump administration did not see conflict with China, but he sort of juxtaposed that with a warning, speaking imminent threat posed by China, just naming them in that plenary session. And he spoke about, on record, he said, the U.S. will not be pushed out of the critical region, will not let our allies and partners be subordinate and intimidated. So very strong language. I'm just curious, is there a bit of a paradox of policy, or, the priority is towards a free and open Indo-Pacific? We don't want to conflict with anyone. We want to safeguard a rules-based international order, but there is a hegemonic presence here. And where would that leave the administration priority towards AUKUS that came about a few years ago, which does not include, obviously, India and Japan, but brings in the UK into the Indo-Pacific and has more of a security component to it?
Thanks, Akshobh. I think I've sort of had a few reactions to the speech, and I think that some of those reactions have actually become, or some of my concerns about the speech have actually have become more pronounced in the past couple of weeks. The first, and I think, Evan and Lindsey have already, touched on this point. I think the most obvious dissonance is between a stated emphasis on the centrality, the enduring centrality of the Indo-Pacific and U.S. grand strategy. And you mentioned, Akshobh, in your question, hardware. If you look at the direction of travel, where are we repositioning military assets? Right now, the vector of travel is not really towards the Indo-Pacific. The vector of travel is toward the Middle East. And as far as the imminence of conflict, I don't want to be sanguine. And no one here should be sanguine about the possibility of a conflict between the United States and China, whether a cross-strait scenario or a South China Sea scenario. But again, in terms of imminence of conflict, I'm worried about right now, not imminently, because it's happening in real time, an expansion of the conflict between Israel and Iran that does have very real potential to drag in the United States. So I think the first point of dissonance is between, again, a stated emphasis on centering the Indo-Pacific. And if you look at actually where we in the United States are reorienting our military forces, that would be point one. The second point of dissonance is, I think that the question that a lot of U.S. allies and partners will be asking is, and I imagine that they did ask Secretary Hegseth this, to what extent his views, the views that he enunciated in his speech, to what extent those align with those of the president. If you look at the way that not just Secretary Hegseth, but other senior officials in the Trump administration, whether it's Secretary Rubio and others, have talked about U.S. alliances and partnerships. So they say, for example, that the alliance between the United States and the Philippines, it is ironclad. We are here to stay in the Indo-Pacific. The way that they talk about allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific, the way that they talk about China, I can't help but be struck by how different their perspectives are from those that President Trump has articulated. President Trump, he has certain grievances against China, undoubtedly. I think particularly the size of the trade deficit, China's continued export of fentanyl precursors. But one, I think that President Trump, he tends to take, I think, a rather narrow view of strategic competition. He doesn't, at least from what I have seen, he doesn't frame it in a kind of zero-sum, highly ideological, almost existential way in the way that some of his top advisors do. He has expressed on many occasions, he's expressed a quite friendly disposition towards President Xi, unlike I think the way that some of his senior advisors do. And I think that he does feel that there's a potential for, if not a grand bargain, some kind of maybe a trade breakthrough that leads to perhaps some kind of diplomatic breakthrough. So, and then I'll just make a point, another point of, I think, important disagreement, or at least seeming tension within the administration is, again, the view of allies and partners. So my sense is that President Trump, sort of per the America First disposition or doctrine or viewpoint that he articulated in his first term, he's far more likely to see alliances and partnerships not as strategic multipliers, strategic force multipliers. He's far more likely to see them as economic burdens. So, for example, take the way that he talks about Japan and South Korea. He has repeatedly said, even in recent weeks, he said, what do Japan and South Korea do for us? We do a lot for them. They don't really do much for us. They're ripping us off. Look at the way that he talks about Taiwan. He said that Taiwan stole America's semiconductor industry. He seems rather insouciant when it comes to discussions of Taiwan security. He seems far more concerned about onshoring at least some portion of Taiwan's semiconductor industry. So there's another point of dissonance between the way that the president himself thinks about our commitments in the Indo-Pacific, the way that he thinks about China, that he thinks about alliances and partnerships. A couple of other points. One more point of dissonance is, if you are trying to strengthen alliances and partnerships, it's important that the various aspects of your strategy are aligned. So if on the one hand, you're saying we want to strengthen, let's say, burden sharing with you, we want to deepen security cooperation, but you are simultaneously imposing tariffs. And if you just look right now at some of the conversations ongoing between, say, the United States and Japan, Japan is the United States' single most important ally in the Indo-Pacific. And my understanding is right now that there continues to be a deadlock between the United States and Japan over tariffs. So there's, again, a disconnect between certain aspects of the administration's Indo-Pacific strategy. The last point that I'll make on AUKUS, again, we'll see where that review goes, where that review of AUKUS goes. Even if the conclusion of the review, even if hypothetically the conclusion of the review is, all right, we've done a thorough review, AUKUS, it's good to go, let's keep at it. I think the fact that the review has been initiated, especially given some of the commentary from Trump administration officials that preceded the official launch of the review, I do think that that will send, maybe not shockwaves, but I do think it will send sort of waves of distress in London and Canberra. And I think it raises a broader point that goes beyond the aperture of AUKUS, which is, if you are a core U.S. ally or partner, I think that you can no longer regard this America First worldview as an aberration. I think if you are a U.S. ally or partner, you have to think, you have to prepare for the possibility that going forward, some version of America First will periodically govern U.S. foreign policy. And I worry that that will make U.S. allies and partners, not only in the Indo-Pacific, but also in other regions, I think it will make them warier of sort of making big, bold, sort of sweeping bets with the United States. I think that they will perhaps adopt a more circumscribed conception of what it is that they would like to do with the United States, because they fear it could be upended in another 4 years. And because they have that fear, and because they will accordingly hedge more against a more volatile United States, the flip side is that I think that the capacity of the United States to make big, bold, sweeping bets with its allies and partners will also be diminished. So even if this AUKUS review concludes with saying it's good to go, we've done our due diligence, and it's going forward, I think that it underscores concerns that a lot of U.S. allies and partners have about the long-term reliability and consistency and predictability of the United States.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you raised there, Ali, because Trump 1.0 was far more acerbic on China, on Xi. A lot of the trade tariffs you're seeing right now, sort of precursor to that was Trump 1.0, when he kept on saying the United States has been ripped off. But at the G7 in Canada, he almost spoke about, President Vladimir Putin, sort of the antagonist of so many U.S. presidents, said, oh, should have been kicked out and should have been G8, talked about getting China back in the fold. I mean, they are a G2 economy. So in some ways, there's perhaps this aggressive on one hand, but, sort of almost amiable on the other. And Evan, I wanted to ask you, about ASEAN countries particularly, because we talk about great powers, but we also have to talk about Indo-Pacific countries and ASEAN powers. I mean, Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, who had spent so many years in the opposition on the sidelines, he spoke about, to quote his speech, the onslaught of arbitrary imposition of trade restrictions, and touching on what Lindsey and Ali spoke about, a lot of the trade discussion that's going on right now. And he says, when this sort of falters, the consequences ripple far beyond one region. Is there sort of a concern in your conversation, that you had with ASEAN leaders and ASEAN delegation, that there is sort of this fracture in the liberal international order, that will only kind of this vacuum that's created, that the US may perhaps move away or perhaps be, too stretched to fully focus on the Indo-Pacific, and this fracture of what we're seeing in the liberal international order, where the US wants to look more insular, it'll kind of leave the Indo-Pacific not high and dry, but perhaps wanting more?
Well, I think certainly the question about, the staleness of the argument or the narrative that everything is about rules-based international order is not new. It's been ongoing for the last several years, whether or not you want to talk about Ukraine versus Gaza, or even going back to the Iraq War. So I think, for many in Southeast Asia, when they hear the phrase rules-based international order, I would say, if we're lucky, maybe 60% are skeptical of that phrase, and maybe 40% have to say it because that's the most neutral term to rally behind. And so it's not a singular problem that comes from certain economic statecraft like tariffs under Trump. It's been, I think, a culmination of multiple things. But for a long time, the narrative has always been, China is the revisionist power, but maybe now the US is also a revisionist power in its own way. And so for Southeast Asia, they've always dealt with a version of a rules broken order for a long time now. But the issue, I think, and going back to what Ali said as well, I do think many in Southeast Asia, including in Singapore, I think they have accepted not just the rules-based international order more broadly, but whether or not the role of the United States supporting that particular set of orders may be coming to an end. What comes afterwards is a lot less clear. How to respond to what comes afterward is a lot less clear. But I don't think that tariffs alone was sort of the only thing in which they said, oh, I guess this is why the rules-based international order is broken. I think it's been a question mark for a while. I just think that right now, the basic assumptions about their own strategic postures in Southeast Asia is where the hardest question is. Because if you cannot accept anymore that the basic premise of whatever version of a US-backed order is sort of over, and as Ali said, that it's not a blip, this America First foreign policy, that this is, America is a different country now with a different strategic posture and outlook. What does that mean for the existing strategic posture and outlook that has been designed over the last few decades to be based on US supporting that particular order? So I think this is where many Southeast Asian states are grappling, and this is why you see some of them testing out the waters on BRICS, on minilaterals, on other aspects, maybe even starting to question whether or not ASEAN is the viable third way outside of US and China. If it's not Pax Americana, certainly not Pax Seneca, is it Pax ASEANA? Not particularly the most exciting answer as well. So I feel like the search for what's next is what's keeping many Southeast Asian leaders up at night.
Pax ASEAN, you heard it first on this the Indo-Pacific webinar, and you please do cite Dr. Evan Laksmana as the the author of that for this. Now, I wanted to take that ASEAN question a little more to you, Lindsey. I mean, particularly since trade that Evan brought up, in the previous administration that you served in, IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, was a key element. 14 IPEF partners represent around 40% of global GDP. That's a staggering number. 28% of global goods services trade. We talk about the Suez, but the Malacca Strait's a very important trading strait as well. One of the IPEF's elements of IPEF was that President Biden had also outlined was strengthening relationship with ASEAN countries, co-players in the Indo-Pacific, because it's not just the Quad countries, but a lot of the other smaller states. And Vietnam and Cambodia, key ASEAN countries, are currently facing some of the economic security concern, given that two of the nations hit very heavily by President Trump's tariffs that he announced on April 2. And unlike Beijing, a lot of these countries can't have a stronger riposte to the United States. So, do you feel that ironically this may be missing the forest for the trees, that this may cause some of the ASEAN countries, say smaller ones like Laos and Myanmar that depend heavily on Chinese investment, to perhaps build up more of that synergy with China in an era of Trump's tariffs? And perhaps could you blame them?
Thanks. It's a great question. And I would say this gets back to the issue I raised earlier, where you can say that China is your sort of principal security challenge, but what you actually do on the implementation side matters much more. And oftentimes that's not just about where you put your military forces. And so I think it is no surprise to anyone, Evan would probably echo this, that when you look at US policy in Southeast Asia over the last decade, I would grade us pretty well, at least in the Biden administration, when it comes to engagement with ASEAN as a whole, which we elevated, which we widened in a number of areas. I think I would grade us reasonably well on trying to focus on some of the security challenges our partners were facing in the South China Sea. But we have candidly been missing in action a lot when it comes to the economic and trade conversations that our partners in the region want to have, and especially in Southeast Asia. And that has been particularly acute, the weaknesses of US strategy, I think, when you look at mainland Southeast Asia, where the United States has historically had fairly weak relationships, but where we do have real opportunities on the economic front, where Vietnam has really benefited from some of the decoupling that's happened as US companies have moved out of China. Vietnam has benefited more than anyone, where with Cambodia, despite the fact that the relationship as a whole has been rocky, Cambodia relies tremendously on the US export market. And so those are real opportunities that we have, I think, to shore up what has been a pretty weak sort of US position in mainland Southeast Asia. And it is stunning and hard, if not impossible, to explain in the region why, when you look at sort of a tariff list, that mainland Southeast Asia is at the tippy top of the list of who the United States is going to go after, because there's nothing strategic about it. It just reflects where you have trade deficits. But it is a real lost opportunity, because I think there is, for the United States and Vietnam, with the elevation of that strategic partnership a couple of years ago, a chance to turn the corner in a more real way on what has been a lot of mistrust in the relationship historically, and enter into what could be a much more fruitful partnership. With Cambodia, I think the US and Cambodia were in a little bit of a deep freeze with each other for a while because of US concerns about what Cambodia was doing at Ream. We'd also started to turn the corner a little bit with some engagement between the new Hun Manet administration and the United States that I thought was quite positive. All of that, those were opportunities handed to the Trump administration that I do think probably more than anything else in Asia on the tariff front right now, we shot ourselves in the foot with how we approached Southeast Asia and mainland Southeast Asia in particular.
Indeed. That's a good segue here for Ali to bring us home on this. Shangri-La Dialogue is about getting the premier defense minds, defense chiefs, and a lot of what we spoke about was hard power, but I think soft power is so important today. And the architect of that and the term, codifying that term, sort of Joe Nye, bless his soul, wherever it is. And Ali, I know you had a chance to work with Joe Nye, but from your time at the Belfer Center. So as Lindsey touched on some of the concepts when vis-a-vis US-India relations, missing out on some of the soft power elements with immigration and visas and students, where does soft power now need to factor in the calculus of the administration with the defense chief right now? Because a lot of what I think a former foreign minister in Singapore, Joe, once told us, a journalist at a conference in Singapore, is everyone wants the United States as a friend. No one wants China as an enemy. And I think that's a very stark difference. There may be two powers, but viewed very differently. Xi Jinping and Bo Xilai may have disagreed on various things, but they both send their kids to the United States. So because more generals want to send their kids to Princeton, not Peking. So where is soft power right now in this calculus right now for Washington?
Well, thanks. Thanks for that question, and especially, I will take any opportunity that I'm given to really to pay homage to Joe Nye. It was because of Joe Nye that I became interested in political science, that I became interested in international affairs, and he was a singular figure, a singular mentor, and it's poignant actually that his very last essay, when he passed, his essay with Bob Cohen and the new issue of Foreign Affairs was being finalized, and I would really commend it to everyone listening. And it's a real, I think it's a real sort of wonderful sort of exposition or re-exposition of the importance of soft power. Soft power, matters because first, there's the practical reason. When others want to engage with you of their own accord, and you don't have to coerce them, when others want to follow your lead without your having to coerce them, it's less costly. So there's just the practical importance of soft power. I think that there's a more enduring importance of soft power as integral to America, not just as the world superpower, but America as a dream, America as an idea. And since we are sort of using Singapore as a point of reference, I would be remiss if I weren't to draw here on an observation from Lee Kuan Yew. Lee Kuan Yew, when he was alive, probably with the exception of Henry Kissinger, was, I think, the one diplomat who commanded equal access to and equal respect among both U.S. and Chinese interlocutors. So he was a very close observer of the U.S.-China relationship. And he was asked again and again and again, do you think that China will ever overtake the United States for global preeminence? And one of the answers that one of the points that he made again and again was, he said, China can draw on the talents of roughly 1.3 or 1.4 billion people, namely its domestic population. He said the United States can draw on the talents of the entire world. So he said that as long as the United States maintains its openness to people, openness to ideas, he said, I think that the United States will be fine. I do worry that with some of the measures that the administration is taking on immigration, some of the measures that it's taking on a whole host of fronts, the United States is presenting a more fearful picture to students from around the world, entrepreneurs from around the world, researchers from around the world, many of whom are from China, many of whom are from India. I think openness has long been a critical source of economic strength, but also strength, more importantly, for America as an idea and as a country that, for all of its flaws at home, for all of its flaws abroad, it remains the one country that does attract people from around the world. So I do hope that we will reconsider, some of the policies that we are presently implementing. I think that as long as the United States maintains that openness, we will retain an enduring competitive advantage. But I do feel that we shouldn't take that advantage for granted. It is not immutable, and I think we're compromising it at the moment.
Well, that openness will continue in more of our conversations here. But this, I have to bring this to a close. One is because I don't want to keep between Evan and bedtime because it's very late in Singapore. And Evan, you really need more rest after a very hectic and successful Shangri-La dialogue. Congratulations again to you and the entire team at IISS. Really an amazing conference. And I hope to be able to attend that sometime again in person. Lindsey, Ford, thank you so much. It's wonderful, to have worked with you when you were in government. But now when you're outside government, we can hear your views from an academic and think tank perspective. So thank you. And Ali, Wyne, thank you as always. So thank you to all three of my guests. This conversation is being live streamed on YouTube. So you can go and revisit Evan, Lindsey, and Ali's Pearl of Wisdoms. And of course, we'll have them more for our future dialogue series. So I'll have to bring this one to a close. And until next time, until next month, do tune in. Thank you as always.